There are acts of cruelty so severe that they seem to reverberate across time itself. On a cotton plantation deep in rural Georgia in December of 1854, an overseer named Silas Harrow committed one such act. What unfolded during the 23 days following his final, deliberate act of contempt has never been fully explained by historians who later studied the plantation's surviving records. 7 individuals witnessed his death, yet no 2 accounts matched. The county coroner's report, filed on December 26, 1854, contains a single word scratched out with such violent force that the pen ripped through the paper. Beneath it, written in a different hand and a different ink, appears the phrase, "natural causes." But the photographs taken of Harrow's body, unusual for that time period, tell another story entirely. His neck bore marks the examining doctor could not account for, concentrated in a pattern that looked almost intentional, as if placed there by design. Before continuing with the story of Silas Harrow and the Thornhill Plantation, I need you to do something for me. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this, stories buried in forgotten archives and sealed county records, don't surface very often. And tell me this, where are you listening from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments. You might be closer to places like this than you realize. Thornhill Plantation lay in the low country of Georgia, where the Ogeechee River cut its winding path through red clay soil and endless stretches of pine forest. By 1854, it had become one of the most profitable cotton operations in the region, covering nearly 2,000 acres and forcing more than 140 enslaved people to work its fields. The plantation house itself stood as a monument to wealth extracted from suffering. 3 towering stories of white columns and sweeping wraparound porches, visible for miles across the flat cotton fields. Spanish moss draped from the live oaks lining the long drive to main house, casting shifting shadows that moved and twisted with every passing breeze. Edmund Thornhill had inherited the plantation from his father in 1848. At 35 years old, he was educated at the College of Charleston and maintained business interests that stretched beyond cotton into shipping and regional banking. He spent most of his time in Savannah, leaving the daily operations of Thornhill to the overseer he employed. Thornhill liked to think of himself as a modern plantation owner, a man focused on efficiency, output, and profit margins. He kept meticulous ledgers, tracking every bale of cotton, every pound of seed, every expense calculated down to the last penny. What he did not track, or care to acknowledge, was the human cost behind those numbers. The people forced to work his land were, to him, nothing more than entries in a ledger, their worth measured solely by productivity and replacement value. Silas Harrow arrived at Thornhill in the spring of 1852, hired by Edmund Thornhill after the previous overseer succumbed to yellow fever. Harrow came with letters of recommendation from plantations in South Carolina and Alabama, each one praising his ability to maintain discipline and maximize output. He was a compact man, no more than 5 feet 7 inches tall, with a face hardened by years in the sun, and a voice that snapped across the fields like the crack of a whip. His eyes were pale gray, cold, observant, always calculating. He dressed plainly in the rough cotton shirts, wool trousers, and heavy boots of his position, but he carried himself with an authority that demanded submission. The enslaved people quickly learned that Harrow's cruelty was not explosive or erratic. It was precise and deliberate, engineered to break spirits with maximum efficiency. He believed fear was the most effective tool of control, and he wielded it carefully. A man who worked too slowly would see his food rations reduced. A woman who dared to speak back would be assigned the most degrading and exhausting labor. Children who cried too often were taken from their mothers. Harrow understood that physical violence left visible marks that could diminish a person's monetary value, so he preferred psychological torment, the kind that left no scars on the skin but hollowed people out from the inside. Among those laboring in the cotton fields was a woman named Ruth. In the autumn of 1854, she was 38 years old, though hardship made her appear far older. Years of relentless labor had bent her back and twisted her hands, yet her eyes remained sharp, alert, and intelligent. Ruth had been born on Thornhill land, as had her mother before her. She had spent her entire life confined within the plantation's boundaries, never traveling more than 10 miles from the place she first drew breath. She worked as a field hand, rising before sunrise to pick cotton until her fingers split and bled, her back screaming in pain, her body driven far beyond what should have been humanly possible. But Ruth was more than a field worker. Within the enslaved community, she served as an unofficial healer, relying on knowledge passed down through generations. She used herbs to treat fevers, poultices to draw infection from wounds, and teas that eased pain or helped women endure childbirth. Her mother had been a healer, and her grandmother before that. Their knowledge carried across the ocean from Africa, then adapted to unfamiliar plants and harsh new conditions. Ruth knew which bark could lower a fever, which roots could stop bleeding, which leaves could dull the agony of labor. She knew how to set broken bones, soothe burns, and recognize infection before it became fatal. This knowledge made her invaluable to the enslaved people, a rare source of hope and comfort in a world designed to strip both away. When a child fell sick, it was Ruth they sought out. When a woman went into labor, Ruth guided the new life into the world. When a man was injured in the fields, Ruth knew how to keep the wound from rotting. She worked quietly, never drawing attention to herself, never asking for praise or recognition. She simply did what needed to be done, using the knowledge entrusted to her by generations before. But that same knowledge made her dangerous in Harold's eyes. He distrusted anything he could not fully control. Ruth's influence among the enslaved people represented a form of power that existed beyond his authority. When they turned to Ruth for help, they were not turning to him. When Ruth eased someone's suffering, it reminded them that kindness still existed, that humanity had not been completely erased, that something we're holding on to remained. And Silas Harrow could not tolerate that. He needed the enslaved people to rely on him completely, to believe that mercy and punishment flowed from a single source, him. Ruth's very presence threatened that control. The tension between Ruth and Harrow had been building for months, accumulating through small acts of cruelty met with quiet, unspoken resistance. In August, he ordered her whipped for insolence after she asked permission to tend a sick child instead of working in the fields. The child had been burning with fever, delirious and crying out for her mother, but Harrow refused. "The cotton doesn't pick itself," he said flatly. Ruth went to the child anyway, spending an entire night cooling her fever and keeping her alive. The next morning, Harrow had her tied to the whipping post and delivered 10 lashes. Ruth endured it without a sound. Her face remained still, her body rigid. She did not scream, did not beg, did not give Harrow the satisfaction of watching her break. When it was over, she walked back to her cabin with her head held high, blood soaking to the back of her dress. In September, Harrow destroyed Ruth's small garden, a modest patch of medicinal herbs she had cultivated behind her cabin. She had spent years carefully building it, nurturing plants chosen for their healing properties. There were feverfew for headaches, willow bark for pain, chamomile for sleep, yarrow to stop bleeding, comfort to help mend broken bones. Each plant had been selected with care, tended patiently, a quiet act of resistance against the violence of plantation life. Harrow discovered the garden during one of his inspections and ordered it destroyed immediately. Unsanctioned activity, he called it, though everyone understood the real reason. He could not tolerate Ruth having something of her own, something that brought relief and healing without his approval. Ruth stood in silence as 2 field hands, acting under Harrow's orders, tore the garden apart. They ripped the plant from the soil, crushed them under their boots, erased years of careful work in a matter of minutes. The men had tears in their eyes. They knew what the garden meant. They knew how many lives Ruth had eased with those herbs. But refusal meant punishment, perhaps death. So they did what they were ordered to do while Ruth watched, her face calm and unreadable, revealing nothing of what she felt inside. After that, something in Ruth changed. She grew quieter, more withdrawn. She continued to work, continued to help those who came to her for healing, But there was a distance about her now, as though she had retreated somewhere deep within herself, a place Harrow could not reach. Others noticed the change and grew concerned. Ruth had always been a pillar of strength, someone who endured unimaginable hardship and still found reasons to hope. Now that hope seemed to be draining away, replaced by something colder, harder. Another person noticed Ruth's transformation, a young woman named Denina. She was 19 years old, born on a neighboring plantation, and sold to Thornhill 2 years earlier when her former owner died and his estate was broken apart. Denina worked the field beside Ruth, and over time Ruth had begun teaching her the healing arts. Denina showed a natural aptitude. She remembered which plants served which purpose, recognized herbs by scent and sight, and had gentle hands that eased pain. Ruth recognized the gift and began passing her knowledge on, teaching Denina everything she knew. But after the garden was destroyed, the lesson stopped. When Denina asked questions, Ruth answered briefly, then fell silent. When Denina spoke about the future, about continuing the healing work, Ruth would change the subject. It was as if she no longer believed there would be a future worth preparing for. Denina was not the only one who noticed changes that autumn. Joseph, the house slave who served Harrow his meals and kept his cabin in order, observed something unsettling about the overseer. Harrow had always been cruel, but his cruelty had once been controlled, deliberate. Lately, there was a sharp edge to him, a barely restrained fury that seemed ready to erupt. He flew into rages over minor offenses, screaming at workers for imagined slights. He grew paranoid, convinced that enslaved people were conspiring against him, deliberately slowing their work or sabotaging tools. Joseph was 52 years old, gray-haired and stooped, with a careful, deferential manner of someone who survived by making himself invisible. He had served the previous overseer and witnessed much during his years at Thornhill, but he had never encountered anyone quite like Harrow. There was something unstable about the man, something that suggested capacity for violence beyond the ordinary brutality of plantation life. In late November, Joseph saw something that disturbed him deeply. While cleaning Harrow's cabin, he noticed a journal left open on the desk. Joseph could read, a dangerous skill for an enslaved man, one he guarded carefully, and before he could stop himself, his eyes fell on the page. The entry was dated November 20th. It read, "The woman Ruth continues to defy me through her very existence. She believes her silence is strength, but I will break her. I will make an example of her that will be remembered for generations. They will learn there is no power here, but mine." Joseph closed the journal quickly and finished his work, his hands trembling. He considered warning Ruth, but what could he say? What could she possibly do? They were all trapped, all subject to Harrow's whims. A warning might only make matters worse, might draw Harrow's attention to Joseph himself. So he said nothing, carrying the knowledge like a heavy stone in his chest, waiting for whatever was coming. By early December, Ruth fell ill. The sickness struck suddenly, a fever that burned through her body, accompanied by a violent cough that shook her frame. Some said it was pneumonia, common enough in the damp Georgia winter. Others whispered it was consumption, the wasting disease that had claimed so many lives. A few of the older women, those who remembered Africa or had heard stories passed down from their mothers, spoke in low voices of other causes. They said Ruth had been working herself to death, that the destruction of her garden had broken something inside her, that something essential had been taken from her, along with the will to keep fighting. Whatever the cause, Ruth weakened with each passing day. Her fever surged and receded in violent waves, leaving her soaked in sweat one moment and shaking with chills the next. Her cough worsened, deep and tearing, bringing up blood that darkened the rag she pressed to her mouth. She could barely remain upright, much less work in the fields. Harrow refused to excuse her. "She's pretending," he told the others. "She thinks she can avoid work by acting sick. But I know better." Denina did everything she could for Ruth. She brought her water, coaxed her to swallow small amounts of food, and sat beside her through the long nights when the fever burned hottest. But Without the herbs from Ruth's destroyed garden, there was little Denina could do. She tried to recall Ruth's teachings, tried to locate the plants she needed growing wild around Plantation, but it was winter and most of them lay dormant beneath frozen soil. The few remedies she managed to put together were weak, useless against the sickness-consuming Ruth. Other women from the quarters took turns sitting with her, offering what comfort they could. They brought extra blankets, shared scraps from their already meager rations, whispered prayers over her body in the dark. Everyone could see the truth. Ruth was dying. The fever was eating her from the inside out, burning away the strength that carried her through decades of suffering. December 3rd, 1854, dawned cold and gray. A thin layer of frost coated the ground, uncommon but not unheard of in Georgia. The temperature had dropped sharply overnight, and a bitter northern wind cut through thin clothing, leaving everyone miserable and aching. As they did every morning, the enslaved workers gathered at dawn, waiting for Harrow to sign the day's labor. They stood in loose clusters, stamping their feet for warmth, breath rising in pale clouds in the cold air. Ruth was among them, though she could barely stand. Denina and another woman supported her, one on each side, nearly holding her upright. Ruth had wrapped herself in a thin blanket, but it offered little protection. Her face was flushed with fever, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She swayed where she stood, her breathing shallow and labored, each breath turning to white vapor in the air. Harrow emerged from his cabin, a small structure near the main house that served as both office and living quarters. He carried his ever-present writing crop and a ledger where he recorded daily cotton weights. Steam rose from his breath as he surveyed the assembled workers, counting them, measuring their readiness, until his eyes landed on Ruth. His expression twisted into something hard and cruel. "You," he said, pointing the crop at her. "You're still here." Ruth lifted her head with visible effort. Her eyes were clouded with fever, but she met his gaze. There was no defiance there, no challenge, only exhaustion and acceptance. "I can work," she whispered, each word costing her strength. "You're worthless," Harrow replied, stepping toward her, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. "You've been worthless for weeks, eating food, taking up space, contributing nothing. You're a drain on this plantation." Ruth said nothing. She swayed between the two women holding her, clutching the blanket around her shoulders with trembling hands. Harrow stopped directly in front of her. The rest of the workers had gone silent. They knew what was coming. They had seen his rages before, watched how he wielded humiliation like a blade, how he took pleasure in stripping people down. But what followed went beyond even his usual cruelty. "You think you're special," Harrow said, his voice low and poisonous. He leaned in close, so close Ruth could smell coffee and chewing tobacco on his breath. "You think your roots and herbs make you important. You think people need you. But you're nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing. You're property, and not even valuable property. You're used up, worn out, worthless." Ruth's legs gave way. She collapsed to her knees, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. The women tried to hold her, but her weight pulled free. She fell forward onto her hands and knees in the frost, her body shaking with the effort of staying upright. A violent coughing fit seized her, convulsions tearing through her frame. Blood flecked her lips, dark against her flushed skin. Harrow looked down at her. For a brief moment, something crossed his face, not pity, not compassion, but satisfaction. After months of resistance and quiet defiance, he had finally broken her. She was reduced to this, sick, bleeding, kneeling in the dirt, unable even to stand. Then, deliberately, fully aware of what he was doing, Harrow spat. The glob of saliva struck the back of Ruth's neck, just below her hairline, and slid beneath the collar of her dress. It was an act of such total contempt, such complete dehumanization, that several of the watching workers gasped aloud. Even in a world saturated with cruelty, this felt like something worse, something that crossed a line most brutalities still pretended not to cross. The silence afterward was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop. The wind fell away, leaving the air unnaturally still and cold. Ruth remained on her hands and knees, breath coming in ragged gasps, blood dripping from her mouth onto the frost-covered ground. Slowly, with immense effort, she lifted her head and looked up at Harrove. Despite the fever, her eyes were clear, focused. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The look she gave him made several people step back without realizing they were moving. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. It was something older, deeper, something that seemed to see straight through Harrove, to know exactly who he was and who he would become. It was a look that said, "I see you, I know you, and there will be a reckoning." Harrove felt a sudden chill run down his spine. For just a moment, fear flickered through him. Then he shook it off, furious with himself for feeling anything at all, unsettled by a dying enslaved woman. "Get her out of my sight," he said to no one in particular, his voice sharper than he intended. "Put her back in her cabin. If she's not working by tomorrow, she doesn't eat." Two women, Denina and an older woman named Sarah, helped Ruth to her feet and half carried her back toward the quarters. The slave cabin stood behind the main house, arranged in two uneven rows. They were rough wooden structures made from unfinished logs, gaps between the boards allowing wind and rain to slip inside. Each cabin held multiple families, the thin walls offering almost no privacy. Ruth occupied a small space in corner one cabin she shared with 5 other women, barely enough room for a narrow cot and a small wooden trunk containing her few belongings. They laid Ruth on the cot and covered her with whatever blankets they could spare, trying to make her comfortable. But comfort was no longer possible. Her fever surged again. Her skin burned beneath their hands, so hot it was painful to touch. Despite the blankets, she shook violently with chills, her teeth chattering as tremors rippled through her body. Her cough worsened, each convulsion bringing up more blood. Word spread quickly through the quarters about what had happened. People came quietly to Ruth's cabin, one by one, to sit with her, to offer what little comfort they could, to witness her suffering. The small space filled with women, their faces drawn and solemn, their voices hushed. They all knew what they were seeing. They had lived alongside death long enough to recognize it, but this felt different. Ruth had been a cornerstone of their community, someone who had eased pain, delivered babies, and offered care when no one else would. Her death felt like a wound that would linger far beyond the loss of a single life. As the day passed, Ruth drifted in and out of consciousness. At times she opened her eyes and seemed to recognize those around her, trying to speak but lacking the strength. At other moments she was lost in fevered visions, murmuring nonsense, reaching for things only she could see. Denina stayed with her constantly, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool water, whispering soft reassurances that everything would be all right, even though they both understood it would not be. By nightfall, there was no denying it. Ruth was dying. The fever had fully overtaken her, and her breathing grew labored and irregular. She would draw several quick, shallow breaths, then stop entirely for long, terrifying seconds before gasping back into motion. Her skin turned ashen, her lips tinged blue. The women gathered close, holding her hands, touching her face, saying goodbye in the only way they could. Around midnight, something shifted. Ruth, who had been unconscious for hours, suddenly opened her eyes. Denina later said they were completely clear, as though the fever had loosened its grip for one final moment. Ruth looked around the cabin, seeming to truly see each person there in a way that made them feel recognized and known. Then her gaze fixed on Denina. Ruth reached out and grasped Denina's hand with unexpected strength. Her lips moved, and Denina leaned close to hear. Ruth's voice was barely more than a breath, each word difficult, but her meaning was unmistakable. "Tell them," Ruth whispered, her eyes locked onto Denina's. "Tell them some debts get paid whether you believe in the reckoning or not. Tell them cruelty has a cost." Tell them what goes around comes around, one way or another. Tell them to remember. Denina nodded through her tears. I'll tell them, she promised. I'll remember. Ruth's grip loosened. She closed her eyes, and a faint smile touched her lips, as if she had seen something that brought her peace. Her breathing slowed, then steadied, almost calm. The women began to pray, their voices rising and falling in familiar rhythms, the old prayers and songs that had carried them through generations of suffering. Ruth died just before dawn on December 4th, 1854. As the first pale light filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls, she took one last breath, released it slowly, and was gone. The women fell silent, prayers fading into stillness. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Sarah, the eldest among them, gently closed Ruth's eyes. She's free now, Sarah said softly. Whatever comes next, she's free. The enslaved community buried Ruth later that day in the small cemetery at the edge of the plantation, a cleared patch of ground where generations before her had been laid to rest. There were no headstones, no permanent markers, only rough wooden crosses that would decay and disappear within a few years. Still, everyone knew who lay where. They could recite the names and stories of those buried there without hesitation. The cemetery was one of the few places on Plantation that belonged entirely to them, a space beyond white supervision, where they could mourn, remember, and preserve what little of their humanity remained. The burial was simple. There was no coffin, only Ruth's body wrapped in a clean sheet, the best they could manage. 6 men carried her to the grave, walking slowly, their faces heavy with grief. The entire enslaved community followed, more than 100 people moving together through the cold December morning. They sang as they walked, old songs of freedom, rest, and a better world beyond this one. The songs were layered with meanings the white people on the plantation never understood, but which spoke clearly to those who did. There was no formal ceremony, just a few whispered prayers and the singing that rose into the gray sky. The men lowered Ruth into the red Georgia earth, and one by one, people stepped forward to scatter handfuls of dirt over the sheet-wrapped form. Denina was the last approach. She stood at the edge of the grave, looking down at the place where Ruth now rested, and spoke softly. I'll remember, she said. I'll tell them. I promise. Edmund Thornhill, the plantation's owner, did not attend the burial. Such matters rarely concerned him. He left all aspects of managing the enslaved workforce to Harrove. To Thornhill, Ruth's death was simply an entry in an account book. One fewer person feed, one less name to record. He was in Savannah when she died, occupied with business affairs, and would not return to the plantation for some time. Another week. When he finally returned and was informed of Ruth's death, his only response was to ask Harrove whether her passing would significantly affect productivity. Harrove assured him it would not. Harrove, however, had attended the burial. He stood at a distance, watching as the sheet-wrapped body was lowered into the red Georgia clay. Several people noticed how unsettled he seemed. He shifted his weight repeatedly, his hand moving again and again to the riding crop at his belt. His face was flushed, and he kept reaching up to the back of his neck, scratching at it absently, as if something there irritated him deeply. When the burial ended and the people began to drift away from the grave, Harrove raised his voice. Back to work, he called out, the sound carrying across the small cemetery. All of you, mourning time is over. The cotton doesn't pick itself. There was a brief, collective hesitation. They had barely finished burying one of their own, the dirt still fresh on her grave, and already they were being ordered back to the fields. But hesitation was all they could afford. Slowly, reluctantly, they turned and began walking away, leaving Ruth's grave behind. Joseph, standing near the back of the crowd, noticed something strange as Harrove turned to leave. The overseer stumbled, just slightly, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. He lifted a hand to his forehead, then shook his head, straightened himself, and walked back toward his cabin with forced determination. But Joseph had seen it. He had also seen Harrove reach again for the back of his neck, scratching with a frantic intensity that seemed almost uncontrollable. That night, Haro complained of a headache. When Joseph brought his dinner, as he did every evening, he found the overseer sitting at his desk, staring blankly at the wall. The plate of food, fried chicken, cornbread, greens, sat untouched. Haro barely acknowledged Joseph, waving him away with an irritated flick of his hand. "Are you feeling well, sir?" Joseph asked carefully. "I'm fine," Haro snapped. "Just tired. Leave me alone." As Joseph cleaned the cabin, he noticed things that unsettled him. The back of Haro's neck was scratched raw, angry red welt standing out against the skin. There were gouges on the surface of the desk, as though Haro had been digging his nails into the wood. And there was a smell in the room, faint but unmistakable. Something sour and unpleasant, a mix of sweat and fear. Joseph left quickly, disturbed. He returned to the quarters and found Denina sitting outside her cabin, staring into the darkness. He sat beside her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "He's scratching his neck," Joseph said finally, right where he spat on Ruth. Denina turned to him, her face unreadable in the low light. "I know," she said softly. "I saw him doing it at the burial." "You think it means something?" Joseph asked. Denina was silent for a long time before answering. "Ruth told me something before she died," she said at last. She said, "Some debts get paid whether you believe in the reckoning or not." I didn't understand then, but maybe we're about to. December 5th began like any other day. Harov emerged from his cabin at dawn and assigned to work, but those nearby noticed the changes immediately. He was short-tempered even by his standards, snapping at people for the smallest mistakes. His face was flushed, and he kept scratching the back of his neck over and over, the welt Joseph had seen the night before it spread, disappearing beneath his collar. By midday, Harov retreated to his cabin, claiming he needed to update the plantation records. But he updated nothing. When Joseph checked on him that afternoon, he found Harov sitting at his desk, staring at a blank page in a ledger. The lamp was lit despite the daylight, casting long, warped shadows across the walls. Harov hadn't written a single word. One hand scratched at the back of his neck, while his eyes remained fixed on the empty page. That evening, Harov summoned Joseph again. When Joseph entered, the scene was unchanged. Harov still sat at the desk. The lamp burned low, shadows filling the cabin. "Did you hear anything last night?" Harov asked without looking up. Joseph frowned slightly. "Hear what, sir?" "Singing," Harov said. "I heard singing coming from the quarters. A woman's voice. Those songs that people sing." A chill ran through Joseph. He knew this couldn't be true. Since Ruth's death, the quarters had been silent. No songs, no voices raised. The grief was too fresh. But he also knew better than to challenge the overseer. "I didn't hear nothing, sir," Joseph said carefully. Harov finally looked at him. His eyes were bloodshot, and the scratches on his neck had worsened, some of them bleeding. "You're lying," he said flatly. "I heard it. A woman singing. It sounded like it was right outside my window. But when I looked, there was no one there." "Maybe it was the wind, sir," Joseph offered. "It was blowing hard last night." "It wasn't the wind," Harov snapped, his voice rising. "I know what I heard. Someone was singing. Someone was out there watching me." Joseph said nothing. Harov was clearly unwell. The paranoia, the raw skin, the wild look in his eyes. But pointing that out would only invite punishment. "Would you like me to bring you some food, sir?" Joseph asked, desperate to change the subject. "Get out," Harov barked. "Get out before I have you whipped for insolence." Joseph left quickly, his heart pounding. He had served Harov for 2 years and learned how to read his moods, when to speak and when to stay silent. But this was different. This was a man unraveling, slipping away from himself, and Joseph had no idea what that might mean for everyone else. Over the next 3 days, Harov's condition worsened rapidly. He stopped leaving his cabin altogether, sending instructions through Joseph instead. The scratches on his neck spread further, angry red lines like claw marks trailing down beneath his collar and upward toward his hairline. He complained constantly of headaches and of hearing things, singing whispers, the sound of footsteps outside his cabin late at night. On December 6th, Harrove ordered Joseph to fetch Dr. Pritchard, then changed his mind before Joseph could even leave. "No," Harrove said sharply. "No, doctor. They'll think I'm mad. It's nothing, just a fever. It'll pass." It did not pass. On December 7th, Harrove refused to eat, insisting the food tasted wrong, claiming someone was trying to poison him. He accused Joseph of tampering with his meals, of putting something into his water. Joseph denied it, of course, but Harrove wouldn't listen. From that moment on, Harrove would only eat food he personally watched Joseph prepare from beginning to end, and even then he barely touched it. The scratches on his neck became badly infected. The skin around them was red and swollen, oozing a clear fluid that soaked into his collar. Harrove began wearing a scarf wrapped tightly around his neck to hide the marks, but it only worsened the condition, trapping heat and moisture against inflamed skin. On December 8th, Edmund Thornhill finally took notice. He had returned from Savannah to find his overseer effectively incapacitated. The plantation was still functioning, but only barely. The enslaved workers continued their labor, but without Harrove's constant supervision, productivity had noticeably declined. Thornhill was irritated. He was paying Harrove well to manage the operation, and instead the man was hiding in his cabin, apparently too sick to do his job. Thornhill went to Harrove's cabin and was shocked by what he found. Harrove had lost weight. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild and unfocused. The cabin itself was in disarray. Papers scattered across the floor, the bed unmade, the air heavy with the smell of sickness. Harrove sat at his desk with the scarf wrapped around his neck, scratching absently at his arms. "Silas," Thornhill said, "you need a doctor." "No," Harrove replied immediately, his voice tight. "No doctor. It's nothing, just a fever. It'll pass." "You look terrible," Thornhill said bluntly. "You've lost weight. You're not working. And from what Joseph tells me, you're barely eating. What's wrong with you?" "Nothing's wrong," Harrove insisted. "I'm fine. I just need rest." Thornhill frowned and stepped closer, studying him. "What's that on your neck?" "Let me see." "It's nothing," Harrove said, pulling the scarf tighter. "Just scratches. They'll heal." Thornhill wasn't convinced. Before Harrove could react, Thornhill reached out and pulled the scarf away. What he saw made him step back in alarm. The scratches covered nearly Harrove's entire neck, angry red lines weeping clear fluid. Some had scabbed over only to be torn open again. The skin was swollen and inflamed, unmistakably infected. "Good God," Thornhill said. "How did this happen?" "I don't know," Harrove whispered. "I can't stop scratching. It itches. It burns. It feels like something's crawling under my skin." That was enough. Thornhill made a decision. "I'm sending for Dr. Pritchard. You need medical attention whether you want it or not. And you're relieved of your duties until you're fit to work. I'll manage the plantation myself until then." Harrove wanted to argue, but the strength wasn't there. He only nodded and slumped back in his chair, his hand automatically drifting to the back of his neck once again. Dr. Samuel Pritchard arrived on December 9th. He was a respected physician from the nearby town of Statesboro, a man in his 50s with gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard, dressed in the formal black suit of his profession. He carried a leather medical bag and possessed the calm, practiced demeanor of someone who had seen nearly every illness imaginable. He examined Harrove carefully, checking his pulse, looking into his eyes and throat, inspecting the infected scratches on his neck. He asked questions about the symptoms, when they began, how they progressed, what eased them, what made them worse. Harrove answered in a flat, exhausted voice, as though he no longer cared what happened to him. "It's an infection," Dr. Pritchard concluded, "most likely septic, originating from these scratches. The real question is how you received so many of them in the first place. I don't know, Harrow said. I've been scratching. I can't stop. It itches. But what caused the irritation to begin with? Dr. Pritchard pressed. Poison ivy? Insect bites? Any exposure? Harrow shook his head. I don't remember. It just started itching one day and I couldn't stop. Dr. Pritchard frowned. In all his years of practice, he had seen countless infected wounds, but this was unusual. The scratches were concentrated in a single area, the back of Harrow's neck, just below the hairline. They radiated outward from a central point, as if he'd been scratching the same spot obsessively until the skin broke, then continued until the infection spread. I'll clean and dress the wounds, Dr. Pritchard said. I'll also leave you laudanum for the pain and fever. But, Mr. Harrow, you must stop scratching. You're making this far worse. If you can't control the urge, I may need to bandage your hands. I can't stop, Harrow said desperately. I've tried. It itches. It burns. It feels like something under my skin trying to get out. Dr. Pritchard cleaned the wounds with carbolic acid, a painful process that made Harrow gasp and clench his fists. He applied a poultice and wrapped Harrow's neck in clean bandages. He left detailed instructions with Joseph about changing them daily and gave Harrow a bottle of laudanum with strict directions on dosage and rest. Keep the wounds clean and dry, Dr. Pritchard said. Do not scratch. If this doesn't improve in a few days, send for me again. Harrow could not follow those instructions. Within hours of the doctor's departure, he tore the bandages off and scratched the wounds open again. The relief was immediate, but fleeting. The itching faded briefly, then returned stronger than before, driving him to scratch once more. By December 10th, the infection had spread further. Red streaks, the unmistakable signs of blood poisoning, crept up Harrow's neck and down toward his chest. His fever spiked violently, leaving him swinging between burning heat and bone-deep chills. He stopped making sense when he spoke, his words dissolving into feverish rambling. The enslaved community watched these developments with a mixture of fear and grim fascination. No one spoke openly about what was happening, but everyone understood that something momentous was unfolding. Ruth had been dead for 6 days, and Harrow was clearly dying, consumed by an infection that had begun in the exact place. He could not stop scratching, the same place where his spit had landed on Ruth's neck. Whispers spread through the quarters. Small groups gathered after dark, speaking in hushed tones about what they had seen and heard. Some said it was divine justice, that God himself was punishing Harrow for his cruelty. Others said it was Ruth reaching back from beyond death to claim what was owed to her. A few of the elders, those who remembered Africa or had grown up hearing stories from their grandparents, spoke of other things entirely. They talked about debts and reckonings, about how cruelty could poison a person from the inside out, about how the dead sometimes demanded payment for wrongs done to them. Denina listened to all of it, but said little. She remembered Ruth's final words. She remembered the look in Ruth's eyes when she spoke them. Some debts get paid whether you believe in the reckoning or not. Denina did not know whether what was happening to Harrow was something supernatural or merely the natural consequence of infection, stress, and guilt. But she knew Ruth had understood something in her final moments. And whatever that knowledge was, it seemed to be unfolding now through Harrow's suffering. On December 12th, Harrow developed a new and frightening symptom. He could no longer bear to be touched. When Joseph tried to help him change his shirt, Harrow recoiled violently, screaming that Joseph's hands were burning him. When Dr. Pritchard returned to examine the infected wounds, Harrow shoved him away with shocking strength, crying out that the doctor was trying to hurt him. He's delirious, Dr. Pritchard told Edmund Thornhill afterward. The infection has spread into his bloodstream. It's affecting his mind. He needs constant care, and he needs to be restrained if necessary to keep him from scratching. But restraining Harrow proved impossible. He fought anyone who tried to bind his hands, thrashing and screaming with a strength that seemed impossible for a man so gravely ill. Eventually, they gave up. They left him alone in his cabin, checking on him at intervals, but otherwise allowing him to do as he pleased. The house servants who entered the cabin to bring water or check on him began reporting strange things. Sometimes they found Harrow standing at the window, staring toward the slave quarters, muttering under his breath. Other times he was curled on his bed, whimpering like a child, his hands pressed tightly over his ears as if trying to shut out sounds no one else could hear. Once, Sarah found him on his knees in the middle of the cabin, his hands clasped as if in prayer, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he kept repeating. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." Sarah backed out of the cabin, deeply shaken by what she had witnessed. That night she told the others, and the story spread quickly through the quarters. Harrow was apologizing, but no one knew to whom. To God, to Ruth, to the countless people he had tormented over the years. On December 14th, Edmund Thornhill insisted that Dr. Pritchard return for another examination. The doctor arrived to find Harrow in a horrific condition. He had lost even more weight. His face was gray and hollow, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. The infection had spread across his entire neck and down onto his chest, angry red lines radiating outward from the original scratches. The smell in the cabin was overwhelming, a mix of sweat, infection, and something else entirely, something that made Dr. Pritchard think of decay. "How long does he have?" Thornhill asked quietly, pulling the doctor aside. Dr. Pritchard shook his head. "Days at most. The infection is too far advanced. It's in his blood now, spreading through his entire body. There's nothing more I can do." "How did this happen?" Thornhill demanded. "It was just scratches." Dr. Pritchard chose his words carefully. "Sometimes infections take hold in ways we don't fully understand. The body's humors become imbalanced. In Mr. Harrow's case, I believe his mental state contributed to his physical decline. He was convinced someone was poisoning him, that he was being watched. Fear and prolonged stress can weaken a man's constitution, making him vulnerable to illness." What Dr. Pritchard did not say, what he could not say without sounding foolish, was that he had never seen an infection behave quite like this. The pattern, the speed, the way it spread from that single, precise point on Harrow's neck. The timing of it all. It was not impossible. It was not supernatural, but it was unusual enough to unsettle even a man of science. That night, back in Statesboro, Dr. Pritchard sat in his office and opened his private journal, the one he kept for unusual cases. He recorded Harrow's symptoms in detail, noted progression of the infection, and documented his observations about the patient's deteriorating mental state. Then he paused, pen hovering over the page, debating whether to write what he was truly thinking. At last, he did. "There is something about this case that troubles me beyond the medical facts. The infection began in a very specific location, the back of the neck, just below the hairline. Mr. Harrow was compulsively scratching this area before any visible signs of infection appeared. When questioned, he could not explain why, only that it itched, that it felt as though something were beneath his skin. The enslaved people at the plantation have been whispering about this illness. They believe there's a connection between Mr. Harrow's condition and the recent death of an enslaved woman named Ruth. I do not place faith in superstition, yet I cannot deny that the timing is striking. Ruth died on December 4th. Mr. Harrow's symptoms began that same day. The infection is centered on the precise spot where witnesses claim Mr. Harrow spat upon Ruth as she lay dying. I do not know what to make of this. Perhaps it is coincidence. Perhaps the strain of the past weeks. Incident triggered some psychosomatic response that manifested physically. Or perhaps there are forces at work that medical science does not yet understand. Dr. Pritchard read over what he had written, then slowly closed the journal. He never showed that entry to anyone. Years later, after Dr. Pritchard's death, his son, also a physician, would discover the journal and read that passage. He would dismiss it as the superstitious ramblings of an aging doctor. Unwilling to have such unscientific speculation associated with his father's name, he would tear the page out and burn it. December 15th brought no improvement in Horo's condition. If anything, he was worse. The fever raged unchecked, leaving him barely conscious. His skin had taken on a dull, grayish cast, and his breathing became uneven and strained. The infection spread to his face, swelling his jaw and cheeks, discoloring the skin in dark, angry patches. Joseph, who still brought water and checked on him several times a day, found Harrove lying flat on his bed, staring at the ceiling. His lips moved soundlessly. Joseph leaned closer, straining to hear. "She's watching me," Harrove whispered at last. "Always watching." In the corner by the window, standing at the foot of the bed, watching. "There's no one here, sir," Joseph said gently. "You're alone." "No," Harrove said, his eyes never leaving the ceiling. "She's here. She's always here now. Watching. Waiting." "Who, sir?" Joseph asked, though he already knew. "Ruth," Harrove whispered. "She won't leave. I tell her to go, but she won't. She just stands there watching me. Sometimes she smiles. Sometimes she just stares. But she's always there." A chill crept down Joseph's spine. He looked around the cabin and saw only shadows and dim light slipping through the window, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was present, something unseen but close. "I'm sorry," Harrove said suddenly, his voice gaining strength. "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I didn't mean it. Tell her to leave me alone." "Sir, there's no one here," Joseph said again, but Harrove no longer heard him. His eyes closed, and he fell into a restless sleep, his body twitching and jerking as though struggling against something in his dreams. Joseph told the other house servants what he had witnessed, and the story spread quickly through the quarters. The reaction was complicated, satisfaction mixed with unease. Many had wished to see Harrove punished for his cruelty, but watching him unravel into madness and rot was disturbing even for those who despised him. Some felt vindicated, believing his suffering was fair payment for the pain he had inflicted. Others felt deeply uncomfortable, as though they were witnessing something that crossed a boundary between the living and the dead. Denina felt something different. When she heard that Harrove claimed to see Ruth standing in his cabin, she felt an unexpected calm. Ruth had promised that debts would be paid, and now it seemed that promise was being fulfilled, whether through divine judgment, something supernatural, or the natural consequences of guilt and infection. Harrove was facing a reckoning, and Ruth, in whatever form, was there to witness it. By December 18th, Harrove's hallucinations intensified. Joseph reported that Harrove was holding full conversations with people who were not there. At times he shouted in anger, gesturing wildly at empty air. At other moments he fell silent, staring at a corner of the room with an expression of pure terror. "She's here," Harrove said once, his eyes fixed on that empty space. "She's always here now. Watching. Judging." "Who, sir?" Joseph asked quietly. "Ruth," Harrove whispered. "She won't leave. I tell her to leave, but she won't. She just stands there looking at me with those eyes. Those terrible, knowing eyes." Joseph reported this to Edmund Thornhill, who was growing increasingly frustrated. His overseer was dying. Christmas was approaching, and he needed a replacement quickly. The plantation could not run itself, and Thornhill had no intention of managing it personally. He had already begun making inquiries, reaching out to contacts in Savannah and Charleston, searching for someone to take over Harrove's duties. But finding a new overseer proved difficult. Word had spread about Harrove's illness and the strange circumstances surrounding it. Some candidates were superstitious enough to avoid a position where the previous overseer had died under such unsettling conditions. Others simply didn't want the inconvenience of stepping into the role mid-season, with Christmas imminent and the cotton already picked and baled. By December 20th, Harrove could no longer leave his bed. The infection had overtaken his body, and he burned with fever. His skin was gray and waxy, and the stench of sickness filled the cabin. The wounds on his neck had turned black in places. The the flesh dying and decaying while he still lived. Dr. Pritchard returned, took one look at Harrove, and pulled Edmund Thornhill aside. "There's nothing more I can do," the doctor said quietly. "The infection is too advanced. It's in his blood now, spreading everywhere. He has days at most. You should prepare for the end." Thornhill was furious, not at Harrove's impending death, but at the inconvenience. Christmas was only 5 days away, traditionally a brief period of rest even for enslaved people, and Thornhill needed a new overseer immediately. The plantation could not function without one, and he had no desire to spend his holiday managing field hands and cotton production. How did this happen? Thornhill demanded. It was just scratches. How does a man die from scratches? Dr. Pritchard shook his head slowly. Sometimes infections take hold in ways we don't fully understand. The body's humors become imbalanced. In Mr. Harrove's case, I believe his mental state hastened his physical decline. He was convinced someone was poisoning him, that he was being watched, that he was being punished for something. That kind of fear and sustained stress can weaken a man's constitution, leaving him vulnerable to illness. The mind and body are connected in ways we are only beginning to understand. What Dr. Pritchard did not say, he could not say without sounding like a believer in superstition, was that something about this case deeply unsettled him. The timing, the precise location of the infection, the way the symptoms progress, Harrove's rapid mental collapse. All of it pointed to something beyond a simple medical explanation, not necessarily supernatural, but undeniably strange. In all his years of practice, Dr. Pritchard had seen many people die. He had never seen anyone die like this. December 22nd brought a sudden cold snap. Temperatures dropped below freezing, rare for coastal Georgia. Ice formed on the water troughs, and the enslaved people huddled in their cabins, trying to keep warm with threadbare blankets and inadequate clothing. The cold seemed to seep into everything, compounding the already brutal conditions of plantation life. In his cabin, Harrove was dying. He no longer spoke coherently. His words reduced to fevered muttering. The infection had spread across his face, swelling and discoloring it until he was almost unrecognizable. His breathing was labored, each inhale a struggle, accompanied by a wet, rattling sound that could be heard even outside the cabin. Edmund Thornhill stopped visiting. He couldn't tolerate the smell. He couldn't stand watching his overseer reduced to this state. He instructed Joseph to keep Harrove as comfortable as possible and to inform him when the end came. Then he withdrew to the main house, focusing his attention on year-end accounts and the urgent task of finding a replacement. On December 23rd, something unexpected happened. Harrove, who had been unconscious for nearly a full day, suddenly opened his eyes. Joseph was inside the cabin, changing the water in the basin, when he heard Harrove speak. The voice was clear, strong, nothing like the incoherent murmuring of the previous days. "I'm sorry," Harrove said. Joseph turned, startled. Harrove stared at the ceiling, tears streaming down his swollen face, carving clean tracks through grime and sweat. "I'm sorry," Harrove said again, his voice cracking. "I didn't understand. I didn't know. I thought I was doing what had to be done. I thought I was maintaining order. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." "Sir," Joseph said softly, unsure whether to respond. But Harrove wasn't speaking to him. His eyes were fixed on something above him, something Joseph could not see. "Please," Harrove whispered. "Please, I'm sorry. I understand now. I see what I've done. I see all of it. Every cruelty, every humiliation, every moment of suffering I caused. I see it all, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, please, make it stop. Make it stop." Then he screamed. It was a sound Joseph would never forget. Pure terror. The sound of a man confronting something beyond comprehension. Something that stripped away every defense and left him utterly exposed. The screaming lasted nearly a full minute, rising and falling, sometimes forming words, mostly raw sound, the expression of fear too great to contain. The noise brought people running. Sarah and two other house servants rushed into the cabin. Moments later, Edmund Thornhill followed. They found Harrow thrashing on the bed, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. His voice had given out, but his body continued to convulse as if the scream still echoed inside him. "Hold him down," Thornhill shouted. "He'll hurt himself." They tried to restrain Harrow, but he fought with astonishing strength. It took 4 people to pin him, and even then he struggled, his gaze locked on something above him, something only he could see. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, his body went limp. He collapsed back onto the bed, breathing shallow and rapid, eyes open but no longer seeing. "What happened?" Thornhill demanded, turning to Joseph. "I don't know, sir," Joseph said, his voice shaking. He just started apologizing to someone, and then he started screaming. Thornhill looked down at Harrow, at the blackened wounds on his neck and chest, the swollen face, the hollow eyes. "He's dying," Thornhill said flatly. "Finally, Joseph, stay with him. Send for me when it's over." But Harrow did not die that night. He lingered through December 24th, Christmas Eve, in a state that was neither fully conscious nor entirely unconscious. His eyes remained open, fixed on the ceiling, unresponsive. His breathing became erratic, sometimes stopping for long, terrifying seconds before resuming with a gasping wheeze. The servants who entered the cabin reported that his eyes sometimes followed them as they moved across the room, tracking them silently, though he never spoke and never moved beyond the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The plantation observed a subdued Christmas Eve. Traditionally, even enslaved people were allowed a brief respite, time to gather, sing, dance, and forget, if only for a few hours, the brutality of their lives. But with Harrow dying and Thornhill in a foul mood, the atmosphere was tense and heavy. People stayed in their cabins, speaking in whispers, waiting. Denina spent Christmas Eve sitting outside her cabin, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring up at the stars. She thought of Ruth's final words, of the promise that debts would be paid. She thought of Harrow dying slowly and painfully, consumed by infection and guilt, and she wondered whether this was justice, whether this was what Ruth had meant when she said that some debts are paid whether you believe in a reckoning or not. Just before midnight, a sound echoed across the plantation. It came from Harrow's cabin. A long, rattling gasp, followed by silence. Joseph, dozing in a chair outside the door, jolted awake. He listened. Nothing followed. The silence stretched on, heavy and absolute. Slowly, Joseph stood and pushed the cabin door open. Harrow was dead. His eyes were still open, fixed on the ceiling. His mouth was frozen in a shape that might have been a scream or a plea, but it was his neck that made Joseph stagger backward in shock. The infection, which had spread across Harrow's body in angry red lines, had collapsed inward, concentrating in a single place, the exact place he had scratched obsessively for weeks, the same place where his spit had landed on Ruth's neck. The skin there had turned black and necrotic. It had split open, exposing infected tissue beneath. The wound was deep, down to the bone, and it released a smell that made Joseph gag. Sweet, rotting, the unmistakable stench of death. Joseph ran for Edmund Thornhill. The plantation owner arrived carrying a lamp, took one look at Harrow's body, and immediately sent for Dr. Pritchard. The doctor arrived shortly after dawn on Christmas morning. He examined the corpse carefully and began filling out the death certificate. "Cause of death?" Thornhill asked, his voice sharp and businesslike. Dr. Pritchard hesitated. He studied Harrow's neck, the concentrated infection, the unnatural pattern of it. His medical training told him that infections could spread unpredictably, that the human body was complex and imperfectly understood. But his experience also told him that some explanations were better left unspoken, especially in a place already alive with whispers of curses and judgment. "Septicemia," Dr. Pritchard said at last. blood poisoning from an infected wound. He wrote it down, signed the certificate, and handed it to Thornhill. But as he packed his medical bag, he paused. "Mr. Thornhill," he said quietly, "may I ask, the woman who died earlier this month, Ruth, I believe, what was the cause of her death?" Thornhill shrugged, already thinking ahead to logistics, replacements, expenses. "Pneumonia, I suppose, or consumption. Does it matter?" "No," Dr. Pritchard replied slowly. "I suppose it doesn't." But it did matter to him. That night, in his private journal, Dr. Pritchard recorded Horo's death. He noted the progression of the infection, its location, its timing. He also recorded, without knowing exactly why it felt important, that Horo had died exactly 21 days after Ruth's death, and that the infection had sent her precisely where Horo had scratched, the same spot where witnesses said he had spat on Ruth as she lay dying. Dr. Pritchard never showed that entry to anyone. Years later, after his death, his son found a journal and read the passage. The son, also a physician, dismissed it as the superstitious reflections of an aging doctor. He tore out the page and burned it, unwilling to have such unscientific speculation attached to his father's name. But before he burned it, he read the final line his father had written. "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in our philosophy. I do not know what killed Silas Horo, but I am not certain it was simply infection." Silas Horo was buried on December 26, 1854, in the White Cemetery in Statesboro, far from Thornhill Plantation and far from the unmarked graves of the people he had tormented. The funeral was sparsely attended. Edmund Thornhill, Dr. Pritchard, a handful of local businessmen who felt obligated to appear, and the minister who conducted the service. No one from the plantation attended except Joseph, who was required to drive Thornhill's carriage. The minister's eulogy was brief and hollow, filled with generic phrases about a life cut short, the mystery of God's will, the promise of resurrection. The words rang empty. Everyone present knew what kind of man Horo had been. No one truly mourned him. The burial was a formality, nothing more than the disposal of the body and an excuse to move on. At Thornhill Plantation, life continued. Edmund Thornhill hired a new overseer, a man named Crawford. His references were much like Horo's, but perhaps having heard rumors of his predecessor's fate, he proved marginally less cruel. He was still an overseer. He still enforced a brutal system. He still used violence and intimidation to maintain control. But he was careful. He never destroyed anyone's garden. He never spat on anyone. And when someone fell ill, he allowed rest, at least for a day or two. The enslaved community returned to their labor, to survival, to quiet resistance. But something had changed. In the weeks and months after Horo's death, people noticed small things. The cabin where he had died remained empty. No one wanted to live there, and Thornhill did not force the matter. Workers passing it at night sometimes reported hearing sounds from inside. When investigated, the cabin was always empty. Scratching sounds, they said, like nails clawing at wood, like something desperate to get out, or to reach something buried beneath the surface. More importantly, the story spread. Among enslaved communities across Georgia, it became a whispered tale, a story that carried both warning and hope. The details shifted with each telling. In some versions, Ruth became a conjure woman with hidden power. In others, Horo's death grew more dramatic, more overtly supernatural. But the core never changed. A woman had been shown ultimate contempt in her final moments. And the man who committed that act died in agony exactly 3 weeks later, consumed by an infection that began in the exact place where his final cruelty had been delivered. Edmund Thornhill never spoke publicly about Horo's death. In private correspondence discovered decades later, he mentioned it only once, in a letter dated January 15, 1855. The overseer situation has been resolved. The new man is adequate, though perhaps too cautious. I sometimes wonder if Horo's death made him superstitious. These rural folk are prone to such nonsense. Still, productivity remains acceptable, and I suppose a cautious overseer is better than a dead one. Yet Thornhill's own behavior suggested he was not entirely immune to that nonsense. After Hero's death, he spent less and less time at the plantation, preferring his townhouse in Savannah instead. When he did return, he avoided the slave quarters entirely and never went anywhere near Hero's old cabin. In 1858, he sold Thornhill Plantation outright and relocated to Charleston, citing new business opportunities. Those who knew him said he seemed eager to put Georgia behind him, as though the land itself carried memories he did not wish to face. Thornhill Plantation passed through several owners before the Civil War. During conflict, it was briefly used as a Confederate supply depot, then destroyed in 1864 during Sherman's March to the Sea. After the war, the land was divided and sold off in smaller parcels. The main house was never rebuilt. Today, the area is mostly farmland, dotted with a few scattered homes and a single historical marker noting that a plantation once stood there. It says nothing about the people who lived and died on that land. Nothing about Ruth. Nothing about Harrove. Nothing about December of 1854. But the story did not disappear. In the 1930s, as part of the Federal Writers Project, interviewers collected oral histories from formerly enslaved people across the South. Several of those interviews, conducted with elderly men and women who had been children during slavery, mentioned the story of Ruth and Harrove. The details shifted with memory. Some placed the events in Georgia, others in South Carolina or Alabama. Some said the overseer died on Christmas Day, others said New Year's. But the heart of the story never changed. An overseer spat on a dying enslaved woman, and he died shortly afterward, consumed by an infection that began exactly where his spit had landed. One interview in particular, conducted in 1937, stands out. The subject was a woman named Clara Jenkins, 93 years old at the time, living in a small house outside Atlanta. She had been born on a plantation near Thornhill and had heard the story from her mother, who had heard it from someone who was there when it happened. "My mama told me about that overseer," Clara said, her voice still strong despite her age. Said he was a mean man, the meanest she ever heard of. And there was this woman, Ruth was her name, who knew about healing and such. She could cure fevers, help with birthing, set bones. Folks depended on her. But that overseer, he hated her, hated that people looked to her instead of him. So he made her life miserable, tore up her garden, had her whipped, worked her when she was sick. And when she was dying, when she could barely stand, he spat on her like she was nothing, like she wasn't human. Clara paused, her eyes unfocused, as if she were looking back across decades. My mama said that woman, even dying, she looked at him with eyes that saw everything, knew everything. And she said something. Nobody heard what it was, but she said something. And that man, he started scratching his neck right where he'd spat on her. Scratched it till it bled. Scratched it till it got infected. Scratched it till it killed him. My mama said it was 21 days exactly. 3 weeks. And she said that's how long it takes for a debt like that to come due. The interviewer, a young white woman from Atlanta, asked Clara whether she believed the story was true. Clara looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I believe there's things in this world we don't understand," she said slowly. "I believe cruelty has a cost. Whether that cost comes from God or from something else, I can't say, but I believe it comes. I've seen it in my own life, seen cruel people suffer in ways that felt like more than just bad luck. I don't know if it's divine justice or karma or just how the world works. But I believe what you put out into the world comes back to you one way or another." The interviewer pressed further. Did Clara believe that Ruth had actually caused the overseer's death through a curse or magic? Clara shook her head. "I don't know about curses or magic. My mama didn't believe in that, and neither do I. But I believe in consequences. I believe when you treat people with cruelty, when you strip them of their humanity and grind them down, something happens. Maybe it's guilt eating at you from the inside. Maybe it's stress breaking your body. Maybe it's just that cruel people make enemies, and sooner or later those enemies find a way to strike back. Or maybe it's something else, something we don't have words for. All I know is this, that overseer spat on a dying woman, and 3 weeks later he was dead, killed by an infection that started right where he'd spat. You can call that coincidence if you want. My mama didn't, and neither do I. Modern historians who have studied Thornhill Plantation have found limited documentation of these events. Plantation records now housed in the Georgia Historical Society archives in Savannah show that an enslaved woman named Ruth died on December 4th, 1854. The entry is brief. Ruth Fieldhand, age 38, died of fever. There are no further details about her life or death, just that single line in a ledger. The same records show that the overseer, Silas Harrove, died on December 25th, 1854. Again, the entry is minimal. Silas Harrove, overseer, died of infection. Dr. Pritchard's death certificate, filed with the county clerk, lists the cause of death as septicemia, blood poisoning from an infected wound. What the records do not show, what can never be proven or disproven, is a connection between those two deaths. Was it coincidence? A brutal overseer who happened to develop a fatal infection shortly after the death of a woman he tormented? Or was it something else, some form of justice or reckoning that operated outside the reach of law and science? Medical historians have offered explanations. Septicemia was common in the 19th century, especially when wounds became infected. Harrove's compulsive scratching could easily have introduced bacteria into his bloodstream. Stress, poor diet, and overall health could have weakened his ability to fight the infection. There is nothing supernatural about a man dying of blood poisoning in an era before antibiotics, but the timing remains difficult to ignore. 21 days, exactly 3 weeks, and the location of the wound, precisely where his final act of cruelty had been delivered. Whether coincidence or consequence, justice or chance, the story endured, whispered, remembered, passed down not through ledgers or official reports, but through voices, through memory, through people who understood that some acts leave marks deeper than scars, and that some debts, sooner or later, are always paid. The infection concentrated in the exact place where Harrove had been scratching obsessively, the same place where his spit had landed on Ruth's neck. Coincidence? Possibly, even probably, but it is the kind of coincidence that makes people uneasy, the kind that makes them wonder whether there are patterns in the world we do not fully understand. There is another detail, one that is often overlooked in retellings of the story. In the weeks before Ruth's death, several people remembered seeing her working on something in the evenings. After the day's labor was finished, she would sit outside her cabin, carefully handling plants and roots. When asked what she was making, she would only smile and say it was for later, after her death. When the women cleaned out her small corner of the cabin, they found several bundles of herbs and roots neatly wrapped and labeled. Most were familiar: feverfew for headaches, willow bark for pain, chamomile for sleep, yarrow to stop bleeding. These were the remedies Ruth had used for years, the knowledge passed down through generations. But there was one bundle no one recognized. It contained a mixture of roots and dried plants that none of the other healers could identify. They were not from Ruth's destroyed garden. They were different, unfamiliar, possibly gathered from the woods beyond the plantation's boundaries. The bundle was labeled in Ruth's careful handwriting with a single word: justice. The women who found it were frightened. Some argued it should be burned immediately, afraid of what it might mean. Others insisted it should be buried with Ruth, that it belonged with her in the grave. In the end, they did neither. They hid it instead, placing it in a small wooden box and burying it near Ruth's grave, marking the spot with flat stones so it could be found again if ever needed. Whether that bundle had anything to do with Harrove's death is impossible to say. Ruth never used it. She never had the chance. It was simply their preparation for something that never came to pass. At least, not in any way that can be directly traced. Ruth died before she could act on whatever she had prepared. Or perhaps it did come to pass, just not in the way anyone expected. Perhaps the act of preparation itself was enough, a declaration of intent that manifested in the world. Perhaps Ruth's knowledge of plants and roots extended beyond healing into areas modern science does not fully understand. Or perhaps, and this is what most historians would argue, it was simply a dying woman's attempt to hold on to a sense of agency, a belief that justice might exist even if she would not live to see it. The truth, like so many truths from this period, has been lost to time. What remains are the documented facts. Ruth died on December 4th, 1854. Silas Harrove died on December 25th, 1854, exactly 21 days later, from an infection that began in the spot where he scratched compulsively, the same spot where witnesses said he spat on Ruth as she lay dying. These facts appear in plantation ledgers, death certificates, and county records. Everything else, the meaning of it, the connection between these deaths, whether this was justice or coincidence, that is left to interpretation. Was it divine intervention? A curse? Some form of folk knowledge Ruth had inherited from her ancestors? Was it the natural consequence of guilt and stress manifesting as physical illness? Or was it simply coincidence? Two unrelated deaths linked only by the story we impose on them? The people who lived through it had their own answers. The enslaved community at Thornhill believed Ruth had reached back from death to claim what was owed. They believed Harrove's suffering was payment for his cruelty, that justice had been delivered even if it came through mysterious means. That belief sustained them. It gave them hope that even in a world designed to strip them of humanity, there was still some force that recognized their worth and punished those who treated them with contempt. The white community offered different explanations. Dr. Pritchard believed it was a medical case, unusual, disturbing, but ultimately explainable within the science of his time. Edmund Thornhill believed it was bad luck, an unfortunate coincidence that cost him a capable overseer. The minister who presided over Harrove's burial believed it was God's will, though he was careful not to speculate on why God might choose such a painful end. And yet, even among the white community, there were those who wondered, those who noticed the timing, the precise location of the infection, the way Harrove's illness unfolded, those who remembered stories told by their grandmothers, stories of curses, hexes, and folk justice that crossed the boundary between life and death, and found themselves unable to fully accept that it was all mere chance. In the end, perhaps the literal truth matters less than what the story represents. It is a story about power and powerlessness, about cruelty and consequence, about the human need to believe that justice exists, even when the law provides none. It is a story that was told and retold for generations, changing with each telling, but never losing its core truth, that some debts get paid whether you believe in a reckoning or not. So what do you think? Do you believe everything was revealed? Was this divine justice, biological coincidence, or something else entirely? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, stories pulled from forgotten archives and sealed records, stories that make you question what's possible, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who loves a mystery. These stories need to be told. They need to be remembered. The people who lived them, who suffered and died in systems designed to erase them, deserve that much. See you in the next one.